meeting for today. Today's meeting is, as normal, being recorded and webcast, so please bear in mind that you are on camera. I'll ask for the emergency evacuation procedure to be laid out, please.
When the continuous alarm bell sounds, you must evacuate the building by one of the designated exits and proceed to the named assembly point. Designated exits are signposted. Arrangements are in place for the safe evacuation of disabled people.
Thank you. Can I confirm, do we have any apologies for absence, please?
We have apologies from Councillor Robin Moss and apologies from Councillor Ian Halsall.
Thank you. Can I ask committee, please, does anyone have any declarations of interest? No. Moving then on to agenda point 5, urgent business. There is no urgent business which we have. So we'll come to public and council statements, for which I believe we have Mr. Ridgewell.
Yes. So, my name is Ridgewell, over the public transport user groups, but also I'm the passenger representative from the West Wing Combined Authority and North Somerset Council Bus Advisory Panel. The reason I come to speak this afternoon is about the transport levy. The transport levy has been frozen for 5 years by the South Gloucestershire County Council, Bath and North East Somerset Council and Bristol Council, and North Somerset made a contribution. The difficulty we now have is the cost of running buses in Bath and North East Somerset and across the Combined Transport Authority area, which is what it is, with North Somerset, is the cost of running those services has risen. Drivers' wages, engineering, new vehicles, ticketing and cost of fuel. By freezing the levy, you simply will have less bus services. The Mayor who I've just left has actually asked for 3 units plus North Somerset to raise the levy in order to maintain the network of services we now have. Nothing will happen in April, we won't be cutting them then, but watch September if this levy is not paid, because September will be the changes where the cuts will come on those supported services. The instructions from the Department for Transport, which you're not the authority but the Highway Authority, it's very clear. You cannot use the BSIP money, which has been allocated for next year, on supported bus services. That's the 17 million with North Somerset. If we cut bus services, the department's money is in jeopardy, which I'm not sure Baines does not want investment cut. And at the end of the day, as you all know, Labour government's moving towards regional government and city regions, not district councils like Baines. So I'd urge you today, by Friday, when the meeting happens with the board, to make sure we have that transport levy in place. And also that we hopefully can get out of special measures, but that may be subject to government approvals. Otherwise, we're going for another 6 months. But this is important, and that's the reason I've come today. Otherwise, you will see less bus services running from September, and community transport will be the first to get hit. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm aware we've got a number of cabinet members and things around, and obviously we've just been through the budgeting process, which we're discussing things today. Councillor Elliott, is there anything you want to say in response to the moment?
I'm aware that we've been in negotiation with WECA about the transport levy. I don't know whether Sophie, as Exec Director, wants to comment on that.
Yes, so in previous years we've not received a formal request from the Combined Authority to increase the transport levy, and hence it remained level. We have received a request in this year and have been discussing that with them, and that will be finalised in the WECA budget, the Combined Authority budget, which will be published shortly.
Thank you. Any factual questions at all from the panel? Toby? Councillor Simon?
Really a question for Councillor Elliott or Sophie Broadfield. Perhaps you could explain how a levy fits into the budgeting process. I think it counts against our 2.99% ceiling. It's different from precept. It's real expenditure on our budget, isn't it?
I believe it is, yes, and I will hand over to Sophie to answer in detail, but yes, it hits our budget.
Yes, that's right, and it shows up as a line in the resources portfolio, 5.193 million as it stands at the moment.
Thank you. That brings us to the minutes from the last meeting. Can I ask, please, for someone to propose and second? Councillor Bratton proposed and seconded Councillor Simon. There's the correct record. Thank you very much. We need to vote on that. Which brings us to Cabinet Member Update. Do we have, is it Councillor Elliott and Councillor Roper, or one or both?
I think, to be honest, given that the activity since the last meeting, which was only a fortnight ago, has only been budget-based pretty much, I'm not proposing to say very much as a Cabinet Member Update. I'll save it for the introduction, which I guess is the next item anyway.
It is. I will just check. No questions. Are there any questions from panel for members? No. Okay, then we'll move through to the budget report, and I'll invite Councillor Elliott to talk through this.
Thank you, Chair. So, I think a major underlying theme of the budget this year is uncertainty. Whilst it's a huge relief to be away from the chaos of the collapsing Tory regime of the previous few financial years, the new Labour government has been slow to signal the kind of significant reform that will be required if local government is going to move out of crisis mode. We've been promised multi-year settlements, but that's not yet forthcoming. There is more uncertainty than normal around confirmation of the final government settlement after the indicative information received just before Christmas. We won't get final figures on the government settlement until early February. We're told that the cost to local, were told that the cost to local government of the employer's national insurance increase would be fully funded, but it looks like we're only going to see about 50% of our direct costs funded, and none of our indirect costs from third-party care providers, for example. As the panel will know, we've made successful bids for a new special school and new alternative provision school on the Culverhay site, but we're still waiting for central government to confirm when they will release the funding for construction. And the more that that's delayed, the longer we have to bear the costs of sending children out of area. The fact that the government has announced a review into social care, which will be completed in 2028, shows a woeful lack of understanding as to the urgency of the issue facing local authorities with social care funding. So panel members will remember that last year we actually set out a two-year balanced budget proposal. And the panel reviewed the medium-term financial strategy back in September when that was presented. And that started to set out some of the emerging pressures which were challenging the second year of that two-year balanced position. If all things had remained as expected, this year's budget would have involved no change at all. Obviously, we expected some movement. A budget is, after all, only a plan, and as the famous military adage goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But the starting point for our 25-26 budget round, rather than being a balanced situation, was a £14 million shortfall. So the work over the last 4 or 5 months has been to identify savings and income proposals to bridge that £14 million gap. Where we've landed is 6.7 million of income generation plans and 7.31 million of savings plans. The detail of these is articulated in Annex 2.1 and 2.2 of the papers, which I'm happy to answer questions on from the panel members shortly. We have a number of the Cabinet members present and all the Exec Directors to support answering any detailed questions the panel may have on those savings or income generation plans. The scale of pressure we've seen during this financial year has been very significant and unpredictable, so this needs to be reflected in next year's budget proposal. As I've been reporting to the panel throughout the year, that's particularly true in children's services. The market of providers for social care, particularly for those children with the greatest need, is truly broken. In an environment where providers can demand several hundreds of thousands of pounds a year per care package for our most needy children, you don't need many children to come into the system at that level unexpectedly for the budget to be completely thrown out of kilter. However, I'm proud of the fact that as a Liberal Democrat administration, we care deeply about social care. And the budget proposal you have in front of you involves a net increase of around £6.5 million in funding for social care. This is on top of nearly £8 million net increase in the budget last year. The increase in demand, the broken markets and the lack of central government action are not the fault of those individual people, adults and children, who so desperately need the care. So we will always make sure that the funding is in place to be able to meet those needs. On top of that increase in funding for social care, and recognising the list of risk and uncertainty in the budget this year, we're also holding significant contingency and provision budgets to help mitigate against the risk of things not going to plan in year. On top of the usual £3 million of corporate contingency, we're also holding £2.6 million of contract inflation provision to mitigate against the risk of pressure that the employer's national insurance rise will place on contracts from external suppliers, and a further £4.3 million high-risk service demand and cost increase provision, essentially allowing a buffer against the sheer unpredictability of the situation in social care and, to a lesser extent, other departments across the Council. Despite this extremely unpredictable environment, we have managed to carve out some room for increases in funding to some of the areas we set out as priorities in our manifesto back in 2023, and which have now been articulated in the Council's corporate plan: addressing the climate emergency, encouraging active travel, taking care of the public realm through increases in the clean and green funding. But mostly the story today, I think, is one of the Council setting out a cautious, carefully balanced budget which protects the most vulnerable in our communities and tries to mitigate against the huge unpredictability and uncertainty we face. I want to emphasise that many councils and residents of other authorities would be extremely envious of our position. We have healthy reserves. We're not at any risk of finding ourselves in financial difficulty as other councils are, unable to balance the books, making swingeing cuts to services, having to apply to central government for permission to make exceptional council tax rises. One only has to look slightly to the west to see the announcements being made in Bristol Council's budget, where there were mooted cuts to libraries, museums, bin collections, etc. Not here. We are maintaining a well-run, well-managed, stable organisation, and I'm proud of what we're achieving despite the prevailing uncertainty. So, I'm very pleased to present to you a prudent, balanced budget proposal, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Thank you, Councillor Elliott. As people will be aware, the corporate PDS meeting a couple of weeks ago looked at the changes to the budget items which affected the corporate PDS, but as corporate PDS has the scope of the entirety of the budget in its realm, we also have the chairs of the other PDS panels here today. So I'd like to invite, first of all, Councillor Romero to comment, please, on the budget increases and changes for the Adult and Children's PDS panel.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, as you know, we met, I think, about 10 days ago to look at what was put forward in the budget, and I'll just give you a bit of sort of a headlines of areas that we discussed. I think one of the key things, though, was the lack of, I was going to say lack of detail, but I suppose it's more about what is not yet known. So there seems to be, as happened in previous governments, a growing lateness in information from government. And I think this causes a lot of concern about, we're supposed to be trying to set a balanced budget, but there's a lot of things that we still don't know. So, for example, as was picked up by Councillor Elliott just now, around the funding for safety valve for our 2 new schools. Is this actually going to happen? I know last year there were various savings that were predicated on that coming forward, and yet, again, that is still not known. Only now we hear that the increases in national insurance contributions are only going to be funded 50%, not in its entirety. There was talk over the last few weeks over an increase in social grant. We don't know what, the detail of this, so that makes it harder for us to put forward absolute support or concrete suggestions for going forward. And I think one of the things we were very concerned about is we didn't want to be in the same position as we had been last year, when we were caught very much on the back foot because there was a new savings target that was put forward after we'd had our initial meeting, which we then only had an opportunity to speak about at the at this meeting, but then, if you see what I mean. I think some of the points that were raised were around concerns that similar proposals have been put forward to last year, so things like around the reunification scheme, and we don't know entirely how successful that has been last year, and therefore how successful it can be this year. Is too much weight being put on schemes that are not yet fully formed. Just trying to think what else was also spoken about then. I think there's just a sense that there's an awful lot of unknown, and what we also know is that there's a huge amount of work that's done in non-statutory services, and so I guess what's the other thing I just want to say as a vaguely positive note before I finish my sort of comments, is that we have undertaken a piece of work around early help and support, which hopefully next year we will be able to give you a better understanding of all the other pieces that help create a supporting structure and network that is of benefit to people as they go through their lives from birth through to adulthood.
Thank you very much, Councillor Romero. And now can I invite Councillor Waite to comment, please, on the Climate Emergency and Sustainability PDS.
Thank you, Chair. Like Councillor Romero, we actually met last week, in fact last Wednesday, to discuss our budget. Now, as the Climate Emergency Scrutiny Panel, we are non-statutory for most of our activities. So we therefore have a very small budget. It's big, I'm sure, by comparison to other councils, but in terms of scrutiny, which is our job, there wasn't an awful lot to scrutinise at our meeting. I can report that we are unaffected and we have growth in the sector, which is really, really good. We looked through the revenue budget, but we did not look through the capital budget for scrutiny because it wasn't available at the time, or it certainly wasn't in the papers. So we had a very small amount of scrutiny to look at. I'm very pleased to hear about the care that Councillor Elliott just talked about, because I think this is an area where we really do need to try and lead, because we are a caring council, and it is an area where there is a great deal of need, and it is unfortunate that these things are so expensive. And as a previous teacher at Culverhay School, I'm very keen to get that particular facility up and running, because it's a really good building and it needs to have children in it. So very pleased about that. I don't know, Chair, if I'm allowed to talk about the capital projects for scrutiny, for my scrutiny panel. I assume I am. And if I am, I'm very pleased also to announce that we have funding for 3 school streets, which is something that I know Councillor Romero and Councillor Paul May have been very keen to get off the ground, and it's very exciting that we can actually do that in an era where the budget is actually very, very hard for local authorities. So there is good news. We should be proud of our attempts to mitigate against the climate change emergency that we support. And so generally, I think my panel was positive at the meeting and would have been a lot more positive if we'd have had the capital project information before us at the time. And we would also ask, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, to have more of the papers from other areas, simply because the climate emergency does spread across everything, really. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Waite. So I'll then open up to questions and things from the panel for either for our officers, for our members, or for the PDS members and things as well. Councillor McPhee.
The children's costs were very high, much higher than you believe they should be. And you made a comment that you're hoping to do some investigations of that or something through the year. Is it possible for you to say what that is?
I think you're referring to the fact that we have a plan to, I mean, it's things like the capital investment in the new schools and things like that to bring more services back in-house. We have a plan to address the home school transport area. In fact, we've just had an internal report produced around that in order to try to mitigate against the very, very high cost areas. I mean, the thing that's driving the children's the cost in children's budget is that exposure to the external market where we are at the whims of that market. So the more in-house provision we can create, the more our costs will be under our control. We are, I think it's fair to say, battling against 30 years worth of rhetoric which said that private sector was good and public sector was bad. So, you know, the problem there is that we're having to rebuild things that were dismantled a very long time ago. But we are on the road to producing that, to generating that in-house provision. There are things that we can do more quickly, but I say for the big scale stuff like building the new schools, we are reliant on central government releasing the funding for that.
Yeah, it was more the transport that
Okay, so the home to school transport, we have had a report done on benchmarking us against other authorities and looking at the areas where our particular costs are. There's certainly work we can do around the use of single taxi journeys for transporting children, particularly children out of area. Those are by far the highest cost areas of the homeschool transport budget. We have allocated budget for next year for introducing our own in-house provision for that transport, because again, if we can bring that in-house, it will be cheaper than using private contractors, private taxi firms. I don't know if Mandy, do you want to add anything to that around savings measures to reduce the cost in children's and adults?
Yeah, so I think you've covered, thank you, Councillor Elliott, I think you've covered home to school really well. You know, we've had that external review undertaken. We're currently putting together our robust around savings that we've put in the budget, and we are doing the right things by putting in some growth. As Councillor Elliott said, there are several drivers to the children's pressures. One is the external residential markets, and we know our average weekly cost has gone up significantly in the last 2 years, and that's a mix of limited supply and obviously high demand for the sector. In addition, this year we've got more children in residential care than we're budgeted for at year's start as well. So that is definitely an area. It's to do with demand and numbers. So the focus, and I think Councillor Romero picked up on some of it, because we know it's best for young people and their families. If firstly they can stay with their families, and there's some broader arrangement. But equally, when children do come into care, we are always looking and exploring how can we best support them while their need is great, but equally how do we then step them down from the more expensive provision into more appropriate provision, such as in-house foster care, and also eventually to reunify those young people as well. The other work that we do is also on the edge of care and with our early help services. So we are working with families that we know are struggling at times as well within our communities. So it is around home to school. It's trying to get the best deal with those residential providers. It's reunifying children where appropriate and safe to do so, because the child will always be at the heart of those decisions. And it's where we're trying to build our own facilities locally and also recruit our own foster carers. One other area that my colleague has just asked me to mention as well, obviously children with complex needs have a range of needs: education, social care and health needs. So we're working with our health colleagues as well about identifying those health costs and when it's most appropriate that they should be paying for those health costs in those complex care packages.
Thank you. Councillor Blackburn.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, Councillor Elliott, I'm going to sound like a broken record again, aren't I? I've been around this panel for a number of years, and I think consistently the members on the panel have asked for context on budget, just to get an understanding of where we've been as to where we're going. Now we've got the senior management team here. Can I just implore you to give us some data that we can actually then start to understand? That's what we've achieved last year, the year before, and this is the trajectory. Because that's the way you can scrutinise and hopefully be helpful in our observations. Quarter 3, where we were in quarter 2 is not looking pretty. Appreciate the pressures, but quarter 3 is really important to understand where we're at. It's fascinating to me to see that we've got future years assumptions, and if I may, Councillor Simon, I'll pick up on something you said last year in your previous experiences, that annual funding gaps seem to always turn up, and then we get to the end of it and it's all sorted. We're now looking at a 5-year projection that's not really showing all of that, but we're not even looking back for the last 5 years to go, this is where we've been and this is the trends and this is issues. And Councillor Elliott, I totally take on board the change of government and the pressures that gives. But if we're going to have a scrutiny panel to support and advise and understand what we're doing so that we can relay that to our residents as well, just give us some data. Give us some genuine understanding of budget figures, what they relate to and where we're going forward, because this just doesn't help us in our work. Thank you.
Councillor Elliott.
I mean, I'm very happy to work with the panel to produce whatever detail it is you want. I think what we'd need is some clarity around what reports you... So, for example, we have provided Annex 1 this year, which shows you the change in each portfolio line item between last year and this year, so you can see the net change in those individual portfolios, which you haven't had in previous years. And I say, there is no problem with providing data. We just need to understand what it is you want to see in order to be able to do your jobs as effectively as you want to do them. But obviously, we need to know that, 3 or 4 months ago, so that we can start producing the reports. But I say, very, very happy to take input during the year as to how you would like to see budget reports change so that you can more effectively scrutinise. There is no attempt to hide anything. If you want figures, and we've got the figures, very happy for you to have them.
Thank you, Councillor Elliott, and Councillor Blackburn. Happy to work with you and Councillor Moss and things as well in terms of shaping that future budgeting processes. Any other panel members? Councillor Simon?
Thank you. I mean, picking up on that point, I think that these are more transparent budget papers than I've seen in previous years from previous authorities. And I particularly do like the table in Appendix 1, Annex 1, which enables us to get into some of the detail. And no doubt if one wanted to find a more granular line by line of that sort of thing, it would be available, but it probably drown us in paper. These are already highly voluminous, and the difficulty is always getting the balance between line by line analysis and actually being able to see the big picture. so I think we've got a robust proposal here. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of points, if I may. Firstly, I think it's good that we've got a line-by-line risk analysis. That's what, page 33. But I think it needs to be, for the papers that actually go into Cabinet and Council, it would be helpful if they were in the risk severity order. I mean, we were quite right to put COVID at the top of, pandemics at the top of the list 3 years ago, but I think it's now dropping down the list. So perhaps the table could have be in score order, as it were, and have the scores in it, whatever they are after 25, I assume. But that's a useful table to be able to see what the key risks are. And it seems to me that perhaps some of the risks are only moderately stated. I mean, contract inflationary pressure is only marked as likely. I think some people might regard it as highly likely. And that leads me on to my next point, which is the provision for national insurance increases in the social care sector. In adult social care, we usually have a purchasing advantage, unlike in children's, and I wouldn't want us to be squeezing care homes on their ability to charge a realistic rate and force them to further cross-subsidise from self-funders. And perhaps Ms Bishop can sort of just comment on whether we've got an adequate provision to be able to reach a fair settlement with the private sector social care firms.
I'm very happy for Mandy to pick that up if she feels able to.
Yes, you raise a very important point with the national living wage and the national insurance increases that are pending. We have had lots of dialogue with the sector, and that dialogue is ongoing. The government does give us an annual grant, which does allow us to provide an uplift. I think it's fair to say that the sector has fed back, and I know it's been on the news this week as well, that the situation is challenging for them at the moment, and those are the discussions that are ongoing. That work is undertaken by our Director of Adult Social Care. I think, what the sector would like us to be able to give with the grants that come through, and what there is a differential between those two elements, and I have to be straight with that, but those discussions are ongoing, and I know there is concern nationally with providers and with local authorities about the potential cost uplift as well to local authorities, obviously with our purchasing of social care, adults and children's as well. So whilst there is a bigger provider market for adult social care, it is still a challenge, and that's the message we are getting back from the market.
Okay, thanks. Councillor
And just to note that we are, the line for contract inflation in adult social care is showing at just over 3 million for next year, and then dropping off to 1.3 million the year after that. So we are assuming that we're going to see some pressure.
I can't get to it quickly, but what percentage is that? Have you got, if you've got that in front of you?
The overall, I don't know what it is as a percentage of the external contracts. The overall budget for adult social care is somewhere around 60 million. So,
my colleague in finance has said that 3 million represents a 5% uplift.
Thank you. So I was right, 60 million.
Thank you. Any other panel members? Okay. Just a couple from me then, I think. First of all, a couple of questions on achievability side of things. One comes in on those adult services and things. So I think we've got an increase in the budget there of about 3% on last year's budget, and I'd just like a view on whether that's going to be something which is realistically achievable, and achievability in the other direction and things as well. I know we've got a significant amount of money being generated by heritage services, and just like to understand where we see what risk we see in that, and whether we're happy that that's achievable, and if not, that we've got sufficient contingencies and things to cover.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the figures that we put in the budget are figures that the officers have signed off on as being realistic and robust figures. The reason we have the contingency there is because we're recognising that corporately as an organisation we know that there is uncertainty and that there may be pressures. That's, I mean, as I said in my introduction, that the kind of uncertainty and risk around things at the moment is higher than usual. So, you know, but we are mitigating against that by holding those contingencies. I think we've got a good record of delivering on the savings plans in all departments, actually. As a council, we're really good at achieving the savings plans. I think, as I said in the last corporate meeting, that it's predicting the cost increases that is more difficult. So I think the savings that are set out, I'm comfortable that officers will meet their savings targets. You know, they've been good at doing that in previous years. But yes, there is uncertainty, which is why we've got the corporate contingency and the other contingency budgets there, the provision budgets there. I don't know if Councillor Roper wants to comment on heritage specifically.
Yeah, just obviously the Roman Baths is the key driver, and we're only ever as good as last year, and we have to get people to turn up, and there's no guarantee. But the budget isn't just predicated on an increase in visitors, there's other activities going on. So we're budgeting on an additional 90,000 visitors over 24-25 levels, but they're going to be charged more, so that the increase in price base is going to drive some of the revenue. They've got they're not new anymore, but the shop is driving, the retail shop is driving significant amounts of sales now. They've re-merchandised, they've relayed it out, they're investing more in the shop. This year we've got budgeted £3 million worth of, or £2.9 million worth of turnover for the shop. They've also additional guided tours. Guided tours have generated significant amounts of additional revenue. They've got some summer lates programming going on in the evening, so there's a whole range of activities, very much focusing on the domestic market. International travel numbers aren't great, yeah, the corporate and wedding and venue hire is also an area of the growth. So, I mean, you know, there's a very multi-pronged approach to drive the revenue, but there's no doubt that the figures, I think it's about 14.2 million surplus in the budget. I mean, they are pushing it. They are punchy numbers, but they are also, where prudent, cost cutting as well. So it isn't just all revenue generated, there's some cost cutting as well. But they are punchy numbers, there's no doubt about it.
And those are fed into the contingency and things there as well, in case those targets aren't quite achievable.
Do you mind comment?
Yeah, I mean, so the 4 point whatever it is million provision against high risk areas includes, you know, that's not, whilst the biggest drivers in that are the social care areas, we've included something in there for things like heritage. So, you know, it's not, it's assumed that that contingency is I think a prudent amount based on the risk around the increases and savings that we've put in the budget.
Thank you. And then just a couple of things on the capital side of things. First of all, just in terms of a couple of figures and things which I think we've not got at the moment, I don't know if we have them to hand yet or not, or if not, could they follow afterwards, but that would be an understanding of how much the capital budget from this year needs to flow into next year, please, and an understanding of what borrowing we are expecting to go and make for capital programmes over the next year, and whether making that borrowing means that the capital programmes will be fully funded or not.
Yeah, sure. And I know we've had the conversation before about how I think we agree on the fact that the capital underspend every year is not a good thing. I think that we do underspend the capital budget. Schemes get reprofiled into subsequent years. I am, however, comfortable that's not hitting the revenue budget. We're not budgeting to borrow more than we need to. And then I don't know if Gary wants to comment on the process for how we estimate what we're going to borrow during the year and the impact that has on the revenue budget. But it's not like we take all of the capital schemes that require corporate supported borrowing and assume that they're all going to go ahead and that they all need borrowing. You know, there's some more science to it than that.
Yeah, so the figures will be in the Cabinet report. The reason they're not ready for this meeting is because we need to factor in Q3 forecasts and rephasing as well, so it needs to look at the whole picture. So we have provided an annex with the new schemes, and that does set out where they require corporate supported borrowing. So the revenue impact of borrowing and refinancing, repayments is included in the revenue budget to cover that as well.
I'll look up the February Cabinet report. Thank you.
And just to say, of course, a lot of the capital schemes are grant funded, not borrowing funded. So,
yep.
You know, when those get rephased, I think from a project management and programme management point of view, we should be looking at tightening that up so that we're not having to rephase the capital budget to the extent that we do. But if they're grant funded, then we're obviously not drawing down the grant until we do the work, or we have got the grant and we're holding it until we do the work, but we're not borrowing for it, so it doesn't affect the revenue budget.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, a number of different elements we're finding it on. Okay, Councillor Simon.
A couple of points, if I may. The first one's a technical question about borrowing. The dedicated schools grant overspend on high needs means that we as a council have to borrow to fund that, and that presumably has a revenue cost, and I think that falls on the general fund. And I think it'd be helpful if we just flag up what that overspend is in cash terms, what the additional borrowing cost is in cash terms for funding that overspend. The second point was for Councillor May, if I may. I should have given notice. I notice we're down to 4 schools that we are directly maintaining, and that gives me to question whether we can adequately maintain a service for 4 schools, or whether we ought to be either encouraging them to join academies or to ask an academy to run the maintained schools on our behalf, because it seems to me that we're unlikely to be able to employ enough staff to adequately support 4 schools.
I think on the first point in relation to the direct schools grant and borrowing, I'm going to pass over to Gary, if that's okay, and then I'll let Councillor May pick up the point on maintained.
Yeah, you are correct in terms of financing the dedicated schools grant deficit. That does fall on the council as part of its overall financing activity. So we don't kind of track every single transaction across the council, but in generic terms, we've got we're predicted to have 33 million less money than we would have done if government had fully funded our DSG spend. So you can make proxy calculations on what that's costing. If we were saying to borrow that 5%, you're looking at, you know, £1.5 million impact of money we haven't now got to either invest or we've had to borrow earlier than we would have done if that had been fully funded.
Councillor May?
Which is one of the reasons why I mentioned in my introduction about the delay on confirmation of getting funding for building the 2 new schools on the Culverhay site, because obviously that then is part of the programme to help reduce that overspend. And it seems to me that the government's shooting itself in the foot because it's building up a liability against itself, really, by not giving us that money. Because the longer that goes on, the bigger that deficit is going to get. But you're right, there is an impact on us because we're having to borrow to cover that deficit.
Thanks, Councillor Elliott. Councillor May?
Thank you, Chair. Just to flag up the issue around the SEND and the DSG, that is actually off the books in terms of the budget discussions that we're here tonight about. And that's a national problem. And nationally they're saying that that's a black hole that the government have got of something like £4.9 billion. So it's not an issue just for Baines, it's something that affects a much larger marketplace. And your second question was?
Only 4 maintained schools.
Yes, and I've made my politics quite clear on this in the past, that the number of schools that are in multi-academy trusts are currently at 94%. And under those circumstances, that really leaves the local authority in a very, very difficult position in terms of those services that you actually mentioned. But things like school meals, school improvement programmes, a whole range of things, those functions are now quite clearly with the Department for Education across the multi-academy trusts, but our own schools, we've then got no resources in effect to deal with them. So there is a big question about those decisions being made, but those decisions aren't made by the local authority, they're made by the Department for Education in the South West. So there is a process that's going on which we perhaps feel uncomfortable about because we've lost the control of those schools in the way that we used to. So we now, as a local authority, have to develop new skills in the way that we actually communicate with schools. So there's bodies like the Schools Forum, where we sort out the funding, but there's also the School Improvement Board, which we actually then meet the schools with the Department for Education to talk about that. And I've recently invited the Department for Education to come along to the Scrutiny Committee to actually talk about how they actually maintain those standards. Because if a school's underperforming, they then often transfer that school to another multi-academy trust. So there is an issue, there is a process there, but as councillors it leaves us a bit vulnerable about how do we actually, because the general public still expect us to be dealing with education. So I think it's a really good question. And I wish I could just give you a simple answer as saying yes or no, but it's actually out of our hands.
I appreciate that the 94% of schools which are in academies are out of our hands, but I'm worried about the orphan 4, if you like, who don't. Either we are spending a lot of money on providing them the sort of services that the centre of a multi-academy trust would provide, and which the local authority used to provide, or we're not providing them with services. Things like being able to provide the back office services that we would, that if we had 50 schools, we would have a competent back office. I don't think we can provide a good back office and support service for 4 schools.
Thank you, Chair. We could go on in a lot of detail, but I mean, the simple fact is you're right. When you've lost most of your schools, then you can't provide the same level of backup that you used to be able to. I mean, the Education Authority used to provide all the HR advice, and they had files for every pupil, and all of that is now not with us. So it is something where the policies of previous governments, and I say plural governments, to move towards multi-academy trust has also left a really blurred message for an authority like us, where we've got very, very few, and therefore we've had to pull back on most of the services we provide. And other authorities which are at 50-50, and some that haven't moved very much at all. So you then get a totally blurred message around education in the country. So from our point of view, we've got to make sure we work effectively with the schools, but we can't actually run those services for the schools in the way that we used to be able to do. So it's a fact of life, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Councillor Mayor. Anyone else? Councillor Hounsell?
Thank you, Chair. Just want to ask about the estimates of pay inflation. It's 4% in the next financial year and 3% thereafter. They seem quite modest sums. How confident are we that that is likely to turn out to be in, the inflationary figures for pay in the future?
I mean, we are as confident as we can be. That's why the number's there, is the honest answer. You know, those are the estimates that we have. We are working to, and they've been through all of the due diligence and the process of the budget setting. You know, it's not like we've radically pushed back on anything that I'm aware of. I don't know if anybody will want to comment on that.
Yeah, so clearly the last couple of years inflation has spiked, and therefore there has been an increase in pay claims. I think it's pretty clear that inflation now is obviously significantly less than it was 12 months ago, and if you look forward, I think, you know, again, without being able to predict geopolitical events, it feels as though inflation is more stable, and therefore, generally speaking, the expectation is that actually pay pressure will reduce over the next couple of years as opposed to going up. So that's why we allowed more than we have done previously for this financial year, next financial year, but that's then we think that will taper off. But we will obviously revisit all of those assumptions as the financial plan iterates and we know more about the general economic position.
Thank you. Any more on budget? No? Okay. Thank you everyone for the discussion. We have a resolution on that to have someone who proposes to thank the Cabinet Member for resources for the overview of the draft budget proposals, and to invite the Cabinet Member to note the comments of the panel and to take these into account when he presents the proposals at Cabinet and Council. Councillor Tomlin, Councillor Simon, thank you. All those in favour of that? Thank you. Okay, then we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the library system rollout, which I'd like to invite Councillor Ball, Cabinet Member for Neighbourhoods, to introduce the report.
I'll be very brief on this issue, and I'll hand over the officers to actually present the report themselves. Pass on the officers to present the report.
Hi all, for those that don't know me, I'm Liam. I'm the Head of Digital and Customer Experience at the Council. So you've got a report on the library management system, which is an overview. To summarise, we went live with a new library management system in Baines last June, so 6-7 months ago now. We are part of a Libraries West consortium with a number of other councils in the southwest, but it's been a tricky 6-7 months, is fair to say. And that's had a knock-on impact with some poor experience from our residents and service users. That is improving and has been improving for a number of months, but we still aren't in exactly where we want to be. I think that's probably fair to say. So there's a lot of work that's been happening, and there's a lot of work that's continuing to happen. But 6-7 months down the line, we're probably about where we wanted to be 6-7 months ago, without having made any of the more improvements we wanted to make by implementing a new
library management system. That's probably an overall summary, but I'm happy to take further questions.
Councillor Simon?
Yes. Since I was the one pressing to scrutinise this, I'll lead off, if I may. I mean, there's a suggestion here that we might disengage from Libraries West, and I'm firmly against that. I think having a consortium to run a service on a sub-regional basis is the way that local government should be working, and I think that we should rule out any suggestion that we try to go it alone. The linking up of what was effectively Avon, Somerset and Dorset's systems, to use old money, seems to me to be very sensible. So I'm starting from the point that what we're trying to learn about is how to run multi-council procurements, for, primarily for IT, and I don't think that this one has been successful, and I recognise that Somerset was the lead authority, but everybody needs to chip in to get it right for procurements in this sort of area. Certainly, I haven't noticed, and I'm a regular user of the library catalogue, I haven't noticed any improvement in the response speed since the early really dire days. 10 seconds, perhaps even 20 or 30 seconds, wait for a page to load, just isn't 2025 IT. There clearly isn't enough compute power at the centre, and that comes down to both system design and the specification. I mean, I know Councillor Elliott is an expert in this sort of stuff, but, and I'm not, but I can tell an under-spec'd service when I get it. There's a mention in the correspondence with Axial, and thanks for providing both the outgoing and the incoming response, about one key performance indicator, but I've been hoping that we would have access to all the KPIs and some of the monitoring figures, so we can actually see whether the contract correctly addressed the issues that would be important, and whether they're actually performing, or whether they're being held effectively to account. I mean, I recognise that the previous supplier didn't bid, so presumably was getting out of the market. So, you know, it's always difficult when you've got a limited market. But the other council committee, and one of the others I'm involved with, is pensions. And pensions is similar in that there is a major provider of IT for pensions administration in local government. It's got about 2/3 of the market. We're going to have to re-procure that, and that's already starting, I think. So there are lessons to be learned in major IT procurements, and I think we've got some other ones, other major systems probably needed. I'm not sure we're getting enough feedback about that. So sorry to have gone on a bit at length, but that's why I think we need to look at this and what the approach I'm taking.
Okay, so yeah, completely agree with everything you've just said. You're absolutely right. Somerset Council were leading on this as part of the Libraries West Board that they run on our behalf. We are all talking from the same hymn sheet. We are all, as partners in Libraries West, saying the same things, and I'm hoping you received the correspondence letter, because I only received that yesterday afternoon, so apologies for you getting that late. But Axial, the provider, have provided the full 10% service credits, backdated. Lessons learned is absolutely critical. We haven't done a lessons learned piece yet, because we've been in the 6 months' worth of resolution. But yes, there's a lessons learned piece on this that absolutely needs to happen. There's a benefits realisation piece that we haven't even gotten to yet, because we're not even at that stage. But there's a lessons learned piece, and one of those will be, is the contract got the right terms, the service credits are at the relevant level, the service level agreement is at the right level as well. But it is difficult, you're right, when we are one voice of many, and actually, unfortunately, from a size perspective, quite a small voice as well. So I'm not claiming to have all of the answers there, but there's a lessons learned piece that needs to be carried out in the coming months to get to the crux of it.
And are Somerset planning to put that in hand? I mean, is there a plan for lessons learned and service realisation, all the things that should happen after?
Benefits, yeah. So the Libraries West Board have been meeting for the last number of months. They meet weekly, and they also now have two committees that report to them. One is the user group, and another one is the stock, sort of the stock management piece. They again meet weekly as well. So it's fair to say there's a lot going on in this space, and this is changing week by week. Are we ready right now to do a lessons learned? Probably not, while we're still tackling some of the issues like the notifications and other pieces that we need to get resolved for our service users. Will we be ready in 2 or 3 months' time? I would suggest we should be looking then, yes.
Thank you. Councillor Blackburn?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for bringing it. I know Councillor Simon brought this to most of our attention. A couple of observations, really. Absolutely, the lessons learned, but I always think, why do we need to learn lessons when this organisation have been doing what they're selling since at least 1982, they claim, or 2008, if you go by their names? So I'll be really fascinated to see that piece. It's not like a Horizon project that was custom built and new. This is something that they seem to be flogging to a lot of people. My observation about that 10%, that really stuck out from the page. Is that it for such a poor performance? It's shocking. You've got the group chief exec writing to us. We don't even know who she is. She doesn't feature on any of the companies that they list in the UK. So they've not taken responsibility. There's not a word of apology in there. I think it's shocking. And I think if Somerset are going to do their job, they've got to be fairly robust in the way that they express our dissatisfaction at the service that they provided for an organisation who claim that they know what they're doing in this space, because they clearly don't. So thank you.
Again, I'll just second, yes, I absolutely agree. It's challenging working with multiple local authorities when one takes the lead, but there's also benefits to it as well. There's huge benefits to being in the consortium, as we've discussed. But yeah, there's some lessons learned on the contract here, most definitely. And just for relevant things, the contracts that we do directly on various systems at Baines have a much more robust service level agreement and service credit as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Councillor Housen?
Thank you. Just a few remarks. Like everyone here, I think there's no question of withdrawing from Libraries West. It's obviously beneficial. And also, I don't think anybody wants to imply any criticism of the support that Baines officers give to the libraries, in particular the community libraries. I'm speaking for the Salford Community Library and the leaders there, and they're very impressed by the efforts and support that they get from Baines officers. I know at the beginning of the rollout of the changes, there was a huge imposition or challenge for the volunteer leaders to give new passwords and logins to all their volunteers, many who only help occasionally or are not very experienced with IT, and I know that was a huge task, but having got through that, they're satisfied with the support they're getting, but obviously would acknowledge the weaknesses that people have mentioned. So I just want to make that point, that this is about the procurement exercise and the monitoring of the contract is not about the performance or support of Baines officers to the libraries. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Simon?
Well, if I can sort of sum up then, what we're looking for, I think, is when at a suitable stage later this year, we should see something of the lessons learned review and a further analysis of how far good service is being provided. And I hope that Liam will pass on, you know, the flavour of this discussion to his colleague in Somerset. That this is not trying to have a go at Somerset. It's how we can make sure we get things right in future for a service that we all use. Perhaps we should have just formally noted that, I mean, I'm a user of the library. My wife occasionally volunteers, though not as often as she might at Western. And I think, Duncan, you were involved with the Salford Library. So a number of us have involvement with libraries. I think you, Chair, have...
My wife volunteers, yeah.
Yes. So, you know, we come at it both as volunteers and as users. But if we can ask as a committee that there is a further agenda item as lessons learned emerge, that would be helpful. And if that involves a scrutiny jointly with other local authorities, particularly Somerset, I mean, I think there is a model for that in the health field, where there are joint health scrutinies, and a review that brought together a number of authorities might be a good way of actually helping lessons to be learned.
Thank you, Councillor Simon. So then I think we're summarising there then to say we'd like to see back here an update on the lessons learnt, and if we have the opportunity to input into that review, maybe we'd have someone from this committee who would be able to go and input into that. But absolutely we should continue with Libraries West in the meantime. Yeah. Okay, do we need to formally propose that, or is that just by that? Okay, cool, thank you. Then that brings us to the last item on the agenda, which is panel work plan. Does anybody have any items to raise on that? Going and gone. Okay, in that case, thank you everybody very much for attending and your input to all of the discussions. And we are just short of 5:10, and we'll call this to close. Thank you very much.